Hi, everyone. Welcome. There may be people still coming in the next, let's say, 3-4 minutes, but don't let that distract you. You can hear me all right. I have allergies, so my voice, it goes in and out. I'm Carol Muske-Dukes, and I'm hoarse at the moment. I have some announcements to make before we begin. One is that you must silence your cell phones. Okay. During the session. Also, there's a book signing following this session. Book signing for this panel is located at the signing area on the festival map, and it's area 2. So if you want to come by to get some book signs, please do. I'm gonna make a shameless plug here for something called the Magical Poetry Blimp Pilot's Guide, which is, I'm Poet Laureate of California, and my project was creating a poetry handbook for kids and for anyone who wants to read about forms of poetry and learning poetry by heart. It's for sale at a booth called Get Lit, Teen Literacy Project. Get Lit, and it's number 346, and also number 37, Figueroa Press. Ask me afterwards if you want to know more. Sorry about that. And each of our panelists has books. We all have books, I guess, for sale, and I don't know, we'll be signing those today afterwards, obviously, and then also giving readings in the course of the afternoon. Personal recording of sessions is not allowed, just so you know. This is being recorded for USC and for and also for YouTube. We're YouTubing it, as we heard. What else do I have to tell you? We are going to talk, we'll see how it goes. If we're boring, maybe we won't talk quite so long, but we'll probably talk for about 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll open things up to questions. If you'd like to ask questions, and there are microphones on either side here of the auditorium, and you can come up to the mic and ask your question if you're not feeling too shy. Okay, I think that about covers it. Again, welcome. Our panel has been given the rather formidable title of The Poet's Responsibility, Poetic Traditions, Social Values, and Contemporary Culture. That covers a lot of ground, doesn't it? It's hard to put the word poet and responsibility in the same sentence, it seems to me. What are poets responsible for? Who are they, or what are they responsible to? And then to what tradition? T.S. Eliot, as you may know, in his essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, writes about poets connecting to the timelessness of tradition, the timelessness of history, and he doesn't believe they change it so much as enter into conversation with the past. There are other ways, obviously, of looking at tradition. There are many cultures in which poets participate in the traditions of the culture. Social values, I don't know. Huh? Percy Bysshe Shelley said, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. So you have to imagine a Senate made up of poets. Well, they probably do better than... his belief was that poets had a heightened sense of the moral through the imagination and the empathy of the imagination. And about contemporary culture, will poetry change in the face of a changing world? There's another book I'm going to plug shamelessly called Crossing State Lines, which is a book just out from Farrar, Straus and Giroux called An American Renga, and 54 American poets took part in this conversation poem based on the Japanese tradition. Lots of discussion of contemporary culture, lots of discussion of the economy, war, the political, in terms of poetry and so on. So, yes, I believe, of course, we're alive. Poets are citizens. We're in the world. We're part of the culture in which we live. But how we affect it, I don't know. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists, and then each of them, beginning with Henri, will say something, make a brief statement about what I've just mentioned, right?
As you wish.
As you wish, she said. Actually, I was asked by one of our panelists to talk about how attractive each of the panelists are. And so I just want to say we're a very attractive group. I hope you think so. And notice there was no big applause there. Henri Cole is the author of the poetry collections The Marble Queen, The Zoo Wheel of Knowledge, The Look of Things, The Visible Man, Middle Earth, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, Blackbird and Wolf. All these collections are brilliantly represented in his new volume, Pierce the Skin, Selected Poems, which was an LA Times Book Prize finalist this year. He's been poetry editor of the New Republic and once executive director of the Academy of American Poets. And he's very attractive. Amy Gerstler, also attractive, is the author of 11, is that right? Or 12 now, books of poems. Is it 11?
As you wish.
Yes, I can have anything I want, apparently. And she has also been an LA Times book finalist. She's won the National Book Critics Circle Award and is a member of USC's Master of Professional Writing program and a member of the core faculty of the Bennington Writing Seminars. Craig Santos Perez is a native Chamorro from the Pacific island of, I'm going to say Guam, but how is it pronounced the right way?
Guahan.
Guahan, thank you. He is co-founder of
Achoti.
Thank you, Achoti Press, and author of Unincorporated Territory, Sena, his continuing investigation of Chamorro culture. He is at present a PhD candidate in comparative ethnic studies at UC Berkeley, and again an LA Times Book Prize finalist this year. Ed Roberson, also an LA Times Book Prize finalist, for his 8th book of poetry, I think it is, To See the Earth Before the End of the World, has won the Poetry Society of America's Shelley Memorial Award and the Iowa Prize and the National Poetry Series Award. And I forgot to mention that both Craig and Ed are also extremely attractive. That's all I have to say about that. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to indulge me here and begin with Henri. Say a little something about the title of our panel and how he has reacted to it.
Thank you, Carol.
You're welcome.
Let's see, a few weeks ago I wrote a statement. I'm not a good improviser, so I woke up this morning and crossed it out and rewrote my statement. And I think this represents perhaps my own ongoing conversation with myself about this subject. So maybe I'll just read my 2 paragraphs and, well, I can disagree with myself yet again before the hour is out. I think there are situations when poets cannot avoid politics and history. The challenge, in my view, is to find a way to be indirect. A poem that is a straightforward declaration about war, for example, probably will not also have aesthetic dignity. I believe a poem must start from some inner impulse. Though at the end there might be a vision or statement about society, this is not the starting point. It is possible also that as a gay poet, not included in society's encouragements to love, marry, and reproduce, I feel a special responsibility to record what I perceive to be the bleakness of the human condition. But even when a poet is responsible, there is also the complicating burst of hopefulness that comes from the act of writing itself. And I wonder if this doesn't undercut any pure sense of writing as a moral act or as a courageous act or even as a responsible act, since this state of ecstasy, fearing a lessening of intensity, wants only to replicate, which is not, in my view, a responsible reaction at all. So I feel a responsibility to originality and to the arresting use of language and to form and to the history of poetry. Any arrival near or at perfection should be considered responsible, whether or not one is ethically tuned in to the events of the moment. The only responsibility of the poet, in my view, is to make something original out of language, to reveal the soul's capacity for compassion, sacrifice, and endurance.
Thank you.
Hi. I agree that the title of the panel is a bit of a mouthful or a mindful. For somebody like me who tends to think and write about what might be viewed as the small or the intimate or the personal, this is a great, capacious, explosive topic and pushes me to think about my own work, what it does and doesn't do, and makes me think about poetry's power to move in all ways, emotionally, politically, socially. So for me, what the topic boils down to is a huge enveloping question, some of the questions that Carol posed at the beginning. What's the poet's responsibility as writer, citizen, artist, and human being to her own work and to her fellow humans? And how is a poet to make their work of use? When I was a little girl, my mother would talk about being of use in the world. And sometimes she meant, you know, get over here and scrub the shower. And then sometimes she meant, I'm going to go work at Head Start. And sometimes she meant other things. I think the poet's obligation is to individually determine her duty, her own responsibility every moment, every year, and to keep reassessing that and trying to enact it. I think we all have different proclivities and gifts, different fires in our belly, and I think it's important that people have a multiplicity of kinds of work and kinds of reactions. The first poetry class I ever took, and I haven't taken many, unfortunately, the teacher read us this poem by Anna Akhmatova called Requiem. She was somebody who suffered a lot in Russia under Stalin, and her son was arrested, and she has a little preface to this poem that she wrote much after the poem had been written. And I'm going to read you those lines. She called it, instead of a preface, "During the frightening years of the Yezhov terror, I spent 17 months waiting in prison queues in Leningrad." She was waiting to visit her son. One day, someone picked me out. On that occasion, there was a woman standing behind me, her lips blue with cold, who, of course, had never in her life heard my name. Jolted out of the torpor characteristic of all of us, she said into my ear, everyone whispered there, "Can you describe this?" And I answered, "I can." It was then that something like a smile slid across what had previously been her face. This is kind of a grim pseudo-preface to a long, moving poem of witness, but I believe that when Akhmatova is asked, "Can you describe this?" that all poets have their this, and that's what they're responsible for. I'll just read you one more quote that I liked, that I found when I was researching this topic a little bit. In a talk called Writing, Social Change, and Revolution, the poet Ed Sanders quoted an Allen Ginsberg poem, and here's the little quote from Allen Ginsberg. "Well, while I'm here, I'll do the work. And what's the work? To ease the pain of living. Everything else, drunken dumb show." So I love the idea of poet as questioner, troublemaker, goad, responsible artist, demonstrator of irresponsibility, dredger of her own soul, as the thorn in the side of established pieties and strictures and tyrannies, and for every poet to find their own this.
Thank you. Actually, you know, that story is so moving about Akhmatova standing in line, waiting to get into the prison, and sometimes people quote the woman who asks her if she can describe things as, "Hey, poet, try to describe this," like a challenge. And most movingly, as you indicated, Akhmatova turns to her and says, "I can." yes in Russian, which is da. You know, I can do that. So she rises to the challenge, obviously, of, you know, bearing witness, as you said, and also being useful in a sense. There's two views of this. I just want to interject before we go on. This idea of poetry as useful, which I'm glad that it came up as a possible topic, because there's the other point of view is that poetry doesn't have to have any particular use. That it, W.H. Auden famously said, poetry makes nothing happen, and meaning that it is enough in itself. Henri talked about the aesthetic power of poetry, and those two words together in a sense sound oxymoronic, but that idea of beauty itself and the imagination itself being persuasive enough to change people could be thought of as a use. David Orr's new book, which is called Beautiful and Pointless, I think, he's a New York Times critic, also echoes Auden to some degree. I believe I haven't read the whole book. His point is that poetry doesn't have to do anything for anybody. It doesn't have to have a use. It is enough, again, in and of itself. But that, you know, the famous line in poetry, you know, that, well, poetry is a news that stays news, on the other hand. Poetry is a news that doesn't go away. It changes, you know, with the front page changing, it changes our lives in ways that we can't even imagine. And there's a main current of poetry running through all things. It's just we kind of have to adjust our notion of what we consider useful, you know, or what we think of as life-changing. Craig.
Well, thank you, Carol, and thank you all for coming today. This is definitely the most attractive audience I've ever seen.
So glad you said that.
As Carol mentioned, I'm from the Pacific island of Guam. I grew up there. My parents decided to migrate to the state of California 15 years ago when I was 15 years old. And it wasn't really till my family migrated that I started to write poetry as a way for me to stay connected to my homeland and to my home culture. When I entered college, that was kind of the time of political awakening for myself, and that kind of politicization actually started entering my poetry. So before I was writing mostly cultural poems, and then they became politicized cultural poems. When I entered grad school, I attended the University of San Francisco. I was doing research for my poems because I was writing a lot about my people's history and culture, and so in my research I found this Chamorro rights organization called Famixaidzen, and it's kind of a transnational group that has members along the West Coast and Hawaii and Guam, which are kind of the areas that most of my people have migrated to. And so I kind of got involved with this organization as a poet. So one of the events that they would do is it's an annual conference. And so my role at this conference would, as a poet, would be to read some of my work and to also hold like a writing workshop for the other activists who are not poets or writers necessarily. And so to me that was a very enlightening experience, because poetry gave them a space to voice their voices in a different way, right? And at both of the conferences that I did, there's always someone who started crying as soon as they would read their work, because it was really, for some of them, it was the first time that they had this kind of public poetic voice, right? This meaningful voice, that they had a sense of the importance of what they were feeling. After working with this group for about 2 years, in 2008, I was then asked to go to the United Nations to testify on behalf of Guam and Chamorro people to the Special Committee on Decolonization, which is the United Nations committee that kind of overlooks the 16 remaining non-self-governing territories, which are kind of the 16 remaining colonies of the world, and of course Guam is a colony of the United States. And so I gave a speech, which I thought was quite poetic, at the meeting of the United Nations, and then I decided for my second book to include my United Nations testimony in a more poetic way. So if you buy my book, you'll be able to read my testimony and kind of see how I poeticized it, or made it original, as Henri was saying. last year I was invited by the Guam Humanities Council to return home and to give a series of workshops and high school visits. For me, it was the first time I had returned home in 15 years. So, during this time, poetry was a way for me to connect to home. I never thought it would be the thing that would bring me home, right? And so I gave readings at all the public high schools, all except for one, as well as a few public readings. And I'll just share one story in closing. I was reading at the high school that I would have gone to as my family stayed on Guam. It was George Washington High School, far out in the colonies, right? And so I did a reading of poems from my first book and my second book, and when I was finished, one of the young students started crying, so I asked her why she was crying, and her response was that this was the first time she had ever seen our culture, our history, or our language in a book, right? Before that, she thought that we weren't worthy of literature, and this was a 17-year-old girl saying this. To have that feeling of not being worthy of literature is not something that I feel any human being should have to endure. And so to me, that's kind of this idea of the poet's responsibility is just that, to kind of reflect our humanity back to the readers, whoever our audiences might be. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let me say all of the above. Really, I started out with a real love of the music and poetry, and besides that, my dad taught us how to draw, and I really love the pictures in poetry, so my work is really highly metaphorical. But a lot of that is skills, knowing how to write a metaphor, how to paint a poetic picture. But there's something else, and what I'll do is I'll give you my sense of poet's responsibility and the poet's tradition by telling you a story. I was elected to the International Hall of Fame for writers of African descent, and it's one of those lifetime award kinds of things. And I was really glad to get the award. I was sitting around talking to a couple of the other people, Martine Espada and Donnell Lee or Aki Marabuti. And we were just talking about this kind of thing. But then, and I don't remember who did it, it all of a sudden shifted to, what about you? Where do you feel yourself in this thing? And it came down to, well, you're taking on this responsibility of the tradition. You're taking on this responsibility of trying to bring the humanity and the art in. But then, who the hell told you that you had this responsibility? And that kind of, why did you take this on? And I thought about that. And I told Aki that I had this little secret thing. I got private. I never admitted this to anybody. Well, now you can find it on you can't say anything anymore that doesn't show up on me. But it was a really private thing that I had held my whole writing career, really quiet thing. And what it was I didn't have a lot of teachers, so in those days, you didn't get kind of help. African Americans didn't get the kind of help, so I didn't have a lot of teachers. So I had a lot of friends who taught me, and just talking to people and listening to people. So I was gaining things, but I knew how to give the answers. Someone would give you a question that show up in the newspaper. What is it like to be the only writer of color in a room of language poets? I could give an answer. I mean, I could give the public answer, the learned answer, and say enough about language poetry to make people understand. But there's one other thing, about that. I always said that I'd give the correct answers, but I held the answer. I told Aki, I held the answer to that to myself. I would never call myself a poet. And I said this real early, when I must have been about 20 years old. I never called myself a poet until black people called me a poet. And it was private. I never, people, you get that question all the time. You know, we've all had, you know, when did you decide you were a poet?
Yeah.
Or how did you discover you were a poet? And I had answers to that, you know, experiences and things, you know, just, they make good print. But the real answer, I just never answered the question. I wouldn't take the responsibility of being a black poet, an African-American poet, until they called me that, whoever they were. And I knew their faces, my family, my church, you know, that kind of thing. So I told him that that award from the Hall of Fame was somebody who told me for the first time that I was a poet. And I said, okay, from this point on, I can be a writer. It was really funny because he said, put your speech away, tell that. That's what you'll find on the web. That's what I just told you. My responsibility comes when people hand it back to me. See, so.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We can give a hand for everybody. I do want to leave time for, it's about 12:30, I want to leave time for a Q&A, but I thought maybe we could just talk a little bit more among ourselves about, it seems as if the question of poetry makes nothing happen can be viewed in different ways, or what the poet's responsibility is, if the poet has responsibility, or what form politics takes. Obviously, each of the panelists has had a slightly different view, and I think it's important for us to, you know, talk about what Henri called originality, contextualized within what each person has said. In other words, is there such a thing? Second question, is there such a thing as originality? Can you write something which is original, that is, you know, has never existed in the world before? There's a wonderful Stephen Sondheim in Sunday in the Park with George, I think in that musical, there's a song called Look, the Hat, I think. Look, there is a hat. A child is saying to his mother, he's just drawn, or she has just drawn a hat. Look, there is a hat where there never was a hat, which never fails to move me because it's a question of art. You create something that never existed before. Or do you create something within a tradition? As I mentioned T.S. Eliot in the beginning, or and others have mentioned working within a culture, within a tradition. Does that mean that you are original within the context of the culture or the tradition? So I'd sort of like to bandy that around a little bit, and then maybe we'll go to Q&A. So anybody jump in who wants to respond?
I think I would say yes, which is to say that I think of everything I write as being in conversation with the past, and to some extent every poem I write, you know, if it's an elegy, it's in conversation with other elegies of the past. But if it's a poem of wonder, it's in conversation with other poems of wonder. But I also think that each of us is, I don't know, like a stained glass window or something, that we have individual, we're kind of distinct filters through which our sensibility is original, can imprint language and make something original. So
that's a wonderful analogy of the light coming through. I assume it's the light coming through the different colors of the stained glass.
Absolutely. So the light is the emotion, let's say, fear, wonder, desperation, grief, triumph, whatever it is. But each of us is distinct in some way, and we're able to imprint language in some way. And so I would say, I feel like I'm always conversing with the past, writers of the past that I love. Hopkins pops right into mind. But at the same time, you know, I'm trying to go my way.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. But that works as an analogy. Anybody else want to say something about that, or anything connected to the idea of originality? I don't know, it used to be called making it new. Do we make it new?
I was just going to add, I think, you know, for those who say that poetry is pointless or useless, are people who write poems that are pointless and useless. And
It's not a negative, by the way. I mean, the way they're saying it is not necessarily, I want to just be fair here. I think that's meaning that that's a good thing.
right. I think it's not a good thing. Like, my interpretation of it is saying that these are people who are advocating a certain kind of poetry that doesn't necessarily advocate for anything or for anyone. And so, for me, I feel like, what the poets that I love the most, that I appreciate the most, are the ones who fiercely believe that poetry is useful and that can make change. And these are often people who are teaching poetry, in the schools or in the prisons or in homeless shelters and elderly centers, or who will go and they'll go to protests and rallies, and to see what kind of original metaphors poets can make for certain political protests or certain kind of political testimony. Granted, poetry may not have a direct effect on legislative policy. That doesn't mean that poetry can't empower and inspire those who are trying to make those legislative changes. So
I'm gonna show you the Blimp Guide again, the Magical Poetry Magical Poetry Blimp Pilot's Guide. Because what this is I mentioned a handbook for children in poetry, but we're raising money by selling it to get more copies of it free into the public schools in California. I've taught in prisons, I've taught in schools, and I think it's important not only to teach the message, let's say, that the world needs to change, whatever we consider useful, but also love of language and the beauty of language. And a book like this, in a beleaguered public school system that has very little recourse to what is beautiful, the arts have been taken out pretty much totally, along with so many other things, is not just a question of enriching curriculum, it's a question of letting the imagination grow and be free to become original, to not just accept received ideas. I think that what poetry, isn't about received ideas so much. It's about, you mentioned finding original metaphors for something that you believe fiercely in. You can believe in whatever you believe in, but poetry works as a language, as an aesthetic object and beautiful language only because we connect something that we believe and also love language itself to it.
One of the things that kills creativity is having the student think that the work that's presented to them knows everything, or that the person who wrote it knows everything. Well, you can't. Humanity is way too big. You can't know everything. So the poem that comes to you is a fragment, maybe in Henri's glass window. Maybe it's a blue that you're getting. One person, a blue. Me, maybe, a red. So you're just getting a piece. What you do is you need to have that recorded piece. You need to have someone who knows this much about love or this much about death because you want to know a little bit more. And the sense of he knows only this much and he's waiting for you to respond with more by reading it, but even better, by writing the next poem. I think that's what you're trying to get across to folks with teaching poetry.
It's a conversation.
Yeah, you want to have skilled readers. You want to have skilled readers, and you want to have not just, okay, this is a good metaphor, but you want to have readers who are skilled, but also, like you say, who are talking back to you in the writing. And I don't think any of the writers up here feel that they've written a good poem until they can also feel the response. And some poems you sort of step out with and this is an amen, or this is, so you can feel your poems. And I think what you want to do is you want to write for a feeling, educated audience, and the kind of thing that she's talking about, getting people to be creative in the reading is really important.
I'm going to ask Amy if she has anything to say, and then maybe we'll throw it open to questions from you guys.
Yeah, I'm really eager to hear what questions people have. So
you don't.
I'm ready to rock and roll with questions.
She's ready to rock and roll. Okay. I hope there's some questions after all this. I'm assuming that this is a question over here. Is that correct?
Whippersnappers. No light comes out of an asshole. That's a remix of Rinzai. Combination of, I was just reading about him. So I just wanted to ask the panel what you guys think of poetry's potential and ability to work with the paradox of the human mind and break through limitations and expand horizons, expand consciousness, expand understandings. And just also examples of that, as I see powerfully, is taking a written word and adding melody to it or rhythm, such as certain musicians have been able to do with a poetic sensibility, including Bob Marley. He had a lot of harmony and melody to his delivery, and he took, for instance, War by Haile Selassie, and he just like chanted it in a concert, and he had a very great effect, even singing it in Zimbabwe in its Independence Day. And also Tupac Shakur came from A Rose Through the Concrete. That's one of his more popular poems. And then he was able to take his poetic sensibilities and use it.
Okay, so what's exactly your question?
How poetry can expand consciousness understandings.
Okay, I'm going to let Amy answer because she was so eager to hear questions. Go, Amy.
Well, I would be interested in everyone's weighing in on that. I mean, to me, what you said is not a question so much as it's a description of one of the main things that poetry does in various ways. I completely agree with you. In the best possible way, I think poetry is can be like a mind-expanding drug. But I think that language has that. I mean, even just sitting on this panel and hearing the word decolonization. I hear the word colonization all the time. I've never actually heard the word decolonization. I felt like a trap door sprang open in my head. I want to Google that term. I want to think about it. I want to read writing about it. So I feel like that's one word, which is kind of also to me like an embryonic version of what poems do. You were describing some really inspiring, amazing, multi-talented people who use the music of language and music together. I mean, humans have done this to open each other up and to open themselves up and to communicate and to understand ourselves better, to worship, to find out who we are in relation to other people, always and always. It's one of the better things humans do. So I think you were more eloquent than I'm being, and you kind of summed something up about poetry. So if you're asking, do I think poetry does that, I would say an emphatic yes.
Thanks.
Okay, anybody else want to talk about this, or should we move on to the next? Oh, I think this gentleman is here. Go ahead.
It's in the last decade we've been through, as a country, as a world, tremendous upheaval, war, 9/11, and financial collapse. And I wonder how that has affected your work or not affected it.
I can say a little bit to that. I mean, just returning to my statement, I remember after 9/11, one didn't know what to write, really. But I have to say, I found the deepest consolation in just reading poems about the surf, or about trees in nature, so, I guess that speaks to my comment about indirectness. That is, poems that were, just going back and reading Whitman, for example, I found deepest consolation, and then the sort of more frontally written poems about 9/11 that, began to appear. I don't know why that is. That may say something more about me than about, than others. But,
I guess I would just add that, a lot of the upheaval we've been seeing the past few years is a result of a long tradition of U.S. imperialism. And so for my own work, Guam has been a colony of the U.S. since 1898. And, so that kind of continual upheaval, century-long upheaval has been kind of the catalyst for my work and what I try to write against, right? And I think to the last gentleman's question, mentioning Marley and Tupac is, here are men who, or I should say, here are poets who, have found another way to write these kind of revolutionary songs. And I think what's been, I guess, one of my concerns more recently is how we can get that kind of, both that spirit within our work, but also those kinds of rhythms, right, within the printed word. Because even though music is poetry, but how can we then make poetry music connected to the spoken word movement, as well as long tradition of oral poetics. So yeah.
My reaction to answer to your questions, not immediately after the 9/11 event, I was on a panel with the late Lucille Clifton, and everybody was in shock. The audience, the folks on the panel. Lucille Clifton opened the panel discussion by saying, "Children, it ain't as if this ain't happened before."
Yeah.
And
throughout history.
It changed everything. The writing that I did that has any of that in it is not just that it ain't happened before, but it's that it's still going on, and that I'm not the only human being who is afraid. I'm not the only human being who's, mad or worried or all of those things. So it kind of made a much larger and a much more human thing to have your eyes open to the rest of the world. That's the way it affected me.
I mentioned this crossing state lines, the Ranga that all these poets took part in, and I just would, to give you a sense of maybe how politics and poetry can come together, just read a couple of lines from a couple of the poems. This is like a relay race where each of the poets hands off their 10 lines to the next poet. This is Michael Ryan saying, "How many poets does it take to change a light bulb?" 2. 1 to change the light bulb and 1 to envy the one that got to change the light bulb. How many poets does it take to change the light bulb? 2. 1 to change the light bulb and 1 to write, "I'm screwed." And then he leaps to how many poets in his 10 lines does it take to change a country? How many presidents? How much pain? And moving on to Brenda Hillman, who picks up in the relay his line. She says, "And a light bulb turns earth. Berkeley lovers in a Thai cafe, mint, sweet basil, Gemini showers all this week, solstice almost." Beautiful, right? You can take money out of the empire, but you can't take the empire. Look, enough of these wars. A rabbit crouches in the moon. So this is flowing together, and I'd like to read just a quick little bit from, this is one of the poets was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army stationed in Afghanistan, who happened to have been in the Pentagon when it was hit on 9/11. And he said in that devastation of the Pentagon, there was one object left standing. It was a sort of a lectern with a dictionary open. It was the only thing in all the rubble. So he refers to that. He says, "Pathogens injected, Trojan horse style, temple walls crumble before a small lexicon, altered and stable, unsullied, too briefly a miracle. Our neo-tragedy was their crazy carte blanche. You'd think they would have read their Homer. But like slapping the moron beside the bully, we invade Babylon to applause." And goes on. "The soldier philosopher turns the gun on himself to salvage some meaning, a smirk and a crooked smile. Sure showed them, didn't we? Dead-eye." And there you have, to my mind, there's where you have politics and beauty, the beautiful language coming together, just extraordinary, the power of that, seems to me. Anyway, thank you for your question. And yes.
Hi. First of all, I totally agree with you. It is an extremely attractive panel.
As you are.
Thank you. Mary Howell once said, and this thing she said reminded me of the title of your session, plus you anticipated my question, so I could almost sit down. But her question one time at a writing seminar I was at said, what is it like to write from inside the empire? And I think poets and writers that are now inside the United States and writing you have to contend with that question. And obviously, you've already kind of brought it up. Would anyone like to comment more on it?
Did you say Marie Howe? This was
Yes.
a prompt of Marie Howe?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I can say for myself, I don't think of empire, speaking truthfully. I do feel that I'm always pushing against something as a writer, but I don't think it's empire. I think it's convention that I feel I'm pushing against. Perceived ideas of normalcy, convention, but I can't honestly say empire. I mean, I think it's important for us to remember that we're all writing in a country that basically we're able to write down the horrible things we see and feel without fearing punishment. That's the difference between, say, Akhmatova and all of us. And I think it is important to remember that. And, you know, I'm grateful to be able to be living in a country where I can write down the things that the horrible things that I, you know, drift through my mind and not fear imprisonment or whatever. But, you know, we kind of forget that in terms of, I thought a little bit about it last night during the award ceremony, actually, how quickly we forget that, you know, and how such an event would have taken place. Could such an event have taken place in, well, there's so many other countries where you couldn't even fathom such an event taking place that wasn't, you know, government sanctioned. So that's an interesting thing to remember. So,
I mean, there are those who say that poetry is considered irrelevant, and it doesn't matter what you say, not that many people are going to pay attention, but as soon as it becomes relevant to, let's say, the powers that be, then that's when, you know, your freedom of speech might possibly be jeopardized. You know, it has happened here, and it has happened here many times, actually, that, you know, there's been encroachment on the idea of the First Amendment, but we have fought back. It's true.
Seamus Heaney uses the story from the New Testament where Jesus, riding in the sand, stops the crowd from stoning the prostitute. Do you remember that story?
Yeah.
And so that it's the actual riding in the sand that does make something happen. I mean, that goes against what was said earlier. But I kind of concur with that. I mean, I do think writing does make things happen and can change, if only it changes who we become and how highly developed our souls are. I think that can't be undervalued, you know.
Do we have another question? Yes. Thank you, Barbara.
I'm too short. So I agree with what you were saying. I think of in terms of poetry and its use. It seems that poetry is art in its own right, but not for its own sake, and has relationships and you know, is important in those relationships. And I feel like the same thing with free jazz, right? Is free jazz isn't just something that doesn't have any relationship to anything, but it actually speaks to many things in a surprising and sort of, you know, unusual way. And I want to say, you know, hey, Mumia Abu-Jamal, they just overturned his death sentence, and he is a man who I think is principally imprisoned in this country for all of most people's lives in here for his words, which are poetic, but he's not a poet. I also wanted to say that Ngugi wa Thiong'o is a master of language in both English and Kikuyu, and he was imprisoned when they, in his own country, when they tried to imprison a character that he had written in a play, and they found that it was a character, so they threw him in jail instead. But he also wrote a book called Decolonizing the Mind, which I recommend to you. So my question is, I agree with this thing of, you know, that a poet is the person who can give voice to things. And I wondered, what is it that each of you right now feel that you can describe?
Well, I think all I can describe is, I mean, I think of my poems as x-rays of the self in moments of being. And I guess that's the limitation of my poems, is that, I mean, I'm a lyric poet, and that's what a lyric poem does. It gives you a snapshot of the soul in a moment of being. And that's both that's as far as my poems can go, I believe.
That's an amazing question, because it kind of gets, it is and it isn't like a definition of poetry, which is kind of like its own panel. I believe, you know, that stuff that like Rimbaud and Whitman and many other poets have talked about, that the self contains multitudes. I believe that we're all kind of part of each other, and so I believe that the specific piece of the window that we all write out of it's about describing what it's like to be human in the moment in history that you live, and with the slippery race and gender and body and mind that you're given in this life. And so I think that's, I'm not going to say there's anything I think I can describe. That's what I try to do. Also, I kind of believe that humans are a continuum, so, and we all contain everything, so I believe it's that you try to deal with your own piece of that. Like you try to be some kind of lens for that.
One thing I try to do when I write, I don't think I can answer what I have to describe. I could try, but I try not to. I believe the imagination is a transformational power, and I really think that, I don't want to sound religious about this, but I think the imagination has extraordinary ability to teach us our own imaginations. And I think, as moral as I'm going to get in terms of moral political statement, is that I think the end, the goal, where imagination can lead us if we follow it, is to empathy. And the ability to empathize, that is to say, to live in another person's situation, to imagine being someone else, or being even an animal or an object, anything, is to my mind, the supreme beauty and power of the imagination. So I try not to be too much of a presentist. I try not to live too much in, if I can, in the world as it's being defined right now, because we're only on this earth for a little while. And as Lucille Clifton wisely said, it's all happened before. Everything that's happening to us, I'm not dismissing any of it, but the wars and the suffering all have gone on. And poets have been there to respond to them. But I think that, to my mind, the way to respond, I think, for me, to find a way that the imagination, which is an anarchist, the imagination doesn't have any laws or rules, it just moves toward empathy, I think, if it's creating what I think it's meant to create, then that's enough. You know, to be in touch with one's own imagination. That's why I asked the question about originality when Honor mentioned it, the idea of creating something that never existed before, and it can change the world maybe by people identifying with it.
Great question, thank you. I guess, I mean, thinking about what Carol just said in terms of, right, we only live on this earth for a short time, you know, our poetry, you know, has the power to live on beyond us for a longer time, whether in print or in digital mediums. And so, you know, for me, it's not, what I want to live on is not necessarily a description, but instead it's to me an embodiment. of humanity, right? That's the thing that I feel as a poet that I can at least try to do or try to work towards. And, you know, within that embodiment, I think it is what other people have been talking about, where, you know, it is our imaginations, right? What breaks through these barriers, as well as our connections to our different communities and, you know, and the nation itself. So, yeah, so to me it's like that embodying humanity that I think what poets can at least strive to do.
I just have to add, I'm sorry, that's fine. Thank you. I want Ed to continue, but what time do we have here?
At 1 o'clock, we're supposed to end.
Okay, it's now,
5 more minutes?
it's 12:59 and 17 seconds, so you're going to give us 5 more minutes.
Yeah, I'll give you till 1:05.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The question shakes down to a process question for me. So much is going on, and I was one of those kids who, you know, the parents, the grandparents, what are you looking at? You know, just, you know, you're always staring. I worked in a steel mill and in a rolling mill, and the steel would come through in slabs that are about this thick and about twice this width of this table. And it's a 5-stand rolling mill. So it would start in and it'd be moving very slowly. But by the time you squeeze down and comes out of the last stand, it's going like a freight train. And it goes down the conveyor belt and then hits the pit, and it coils really fast. So young kid, you know, sort of getting money for college in the summertime. I'm sent to the to get coffee, and so I'm walking along, and all of a sudden the coil hits a pit, and it just leaps up into the air, red hot, shoots up in the air, and all the whistles go off, and everybody goes running, and I'm standing there looking at it. Absolutely beautiful piece of steel, this beautiful red glowing thing sticking up in the air. Next day I come into the work, everybody's staring at me with their hands in their pockets, and all of a sudden everybody goes. So for me, the question, you know, what do you describe right now? It's to shut up, you know, and because so much is coming in, thin it out or find a way to filter or pick one of them.
That's
or,
good.
you know, for me, so it comes down as a process question. If you're open and you're alive, you know, you have the problem of shutting up. It's for me.
I don't know. I don't know if we have time for one more question or not. Maybe we should just shut up.
I think I have one more.
We have one more? If you can ask really quickly, and then maybe just one of us.
It's actually a big question, and it's for Craig. I'll just find you, Craig, later, and I'll ask you my question.
Oh, all right. Okay, well, then I think we're up against our deadline, so thank you all very much. And the signing area is Area 2.